Always late with my song. All right, Brubs, we're back with Perfume, the story of a murderer by Patrick Suskind. Oh no, my neighbor's home. Or he's getting robbed. One of the two. 40 pages do I got left? Not that many. In May of that same year, the naked body of a 15-year-old girl was found in a rose field halfway between Grasse and the hamlet of Opio, east of town. She had been killed by a heavy blow to the back of the head. The farmer who discovered her was so disconcerted by the gruesome sight that he almost ended up a suspect himself. When, in a quivering voice, he told the police lieutenant that he had never seen anything so beautiful, when he had really wanted to say that he had never seen anything so awful. She was indeed a girl of exquisite beauty. She was one of those languid women made of dark honey. She was 15, buddy. Smooth and sweet and terribly sticky, who take control of a room with a syrupy gesture, a toss of the hair, a single slow whiplash of the eyes, and all the while remain as still as the center of a hurricane. Apparently unaware of the force of gravity by which they irresistibly attract to themselves the yearnings and the souls of both men and women. And she was young, so very young, that the flow of her allure had not yet grown vicious. Her full limbs were still smooth and solid. Perfume by Patrick Suskind, the story of a murder. Where was I? Her full limbs were still smooth and solid. Her breasts plump and pert as hard boiled eggs, and the planes of her face, brushed by her heavy black hair, still had the most delicate contours and secret places. Her hair, however, was gone. The murderer had cut it off and taken it with him, along with her clothes. People suspected the gypsies. Gypsies were capable of anything. Gypsies were known to weave carpets out of old clothes, and to stuff their pillows with human hair, and to make dolls out of the skin and teeth of the hanged. Only gypsies could be involved in such a perverse crime. There were, however, no gypsies around at the time, not a one near or far. Gypsies had come through the area in December. For lack of gypsies, people decided to suspect the Italian migrant workers, but there weren't any Italians around either. It was too early in the year for them. They would first arrive in the region in June, at the time of the jasmine harvest, so it could not have been the Italians either. Finally, the wig maker, the wig makers came under suspicion. I mean, that's kind of a fucking brilliant deduction. Under suspicion, and they were searched for the hair of the murdered girl. To no avail. Then it was the Jews who were suspect, then the monks of the Benedictine cloister, reputedly a lecherous lot, although all of them were well over 70. Then the Cistercians. How the hell you say that? Cistercians? Then the Freemasons, then the lunatics from the Charity, then the charcoal burners, then the beggars, and last but not least, the nobility. that blood on my finger? Or is that chocolate from my kind bar? Guess I'll taste it and find out. Didn't really taste like either. Then the charcoal burners, then the beggars, and last but not least, the nobility, in particular, the Marquis of Cabri, for he had already been married 3 times and organized, so it was said, orgiastic black masses in his cellars, where he drank the blood of virgins to increase his potency. Of course, nothing definite could be proved. No one had witnessed the murder, and clothes and hair of the dead woman were not found. After several weeks, the police lieutenant halted his investigation. In mid June, the Italians arrived, many with families, to hire themselves out as pickers. The farmers put them to work as usual, but with the murder still on their minds, forbade their wives and daughters to have anything to do with them. You couldn't be too cautious. For although the migrant workers were in fact not responsible for the actual murder, they could have been responsible for it on principle, and so it was better to be on one's guard. Not long after the beginning of the jasmine harvest, 2 more murders occurred. Again, the victims were very lovely young girls, again of the languid, raven haired sort. Again, they were found naked and shorn and lying in a flower field with the backs of their heads bludgeoned. Again, there was no trace of the perpetrator. The news spread like wildflower, and there was a threat. Whoa, whoa, don't close, buddy. I know you want me to get finished with you here, but the news spread like wildfire, and there was the threat that hostile action might be taken against the migrants. When it was learned that both victims were Italians, the daughters of a Genoese day laborer, and now fear spread over the countryside, people no longer knew against whom to direct their impotent rage. Although there were still those who suspected the lunatics or the cryptic marquis, no one really believed that, for the former were under guard day and night, and the latter had long since departed for Paris. So people huddled closer together. The farmers opened up their barns for the migrants who, until then, had slept in the open fields. The townsfolk set up nightly patrols in every neighborhood. The police lieutenant reinforced the watch at the gates. But all these measures proved useless. A few days after the double murder, they found the body of yet another girl, abused in the same manner as the others. This time it was a Sardinian washerwoman from the bishop's palace. She had been struck down near the great basin of the Fontaine de la Faux. Don't know how to say French. Phrases directly before the gates of the town, and although at the insistence of the citizenry, the councils initiated still further measures, the tightest possible control at the gates, a reinforced night watch, a curfew for all female persons after nightfall. All that summer, not a single week went by when the body of a young girl was not discovered. And they were always girls just approaching womanhood, and always very beautiful, and usually dark. Soon, however, the murderer was no rejecting the type of girl more common among the local population. Soft, pale skinned, and somewhat more full bodied, even brown haired girls, and some dark blondes, as long as they weren't too skinny, were among the later victims. He tried not around Grasse, but in the town itself, right in their homes. The daughter of a carpenter was found slain in her own room on the 5th floor, and no one in the house had heard the least noise. And although the dogs normally yelped the moment they picked up the scent of any stranger, not one of them had barked. The murderer seemed impalpable, incorporeal, like a ghost. People were outraged and reviled People were outraged and reviled the authorities. The least rumor caused mob scenes. A traveling salesman of love potions and other nostrums was almost massacred, for word spread that one of the ingredients in his remedies was female hair. Fires were set at both the Cabri mansion and the Hospital de la Charité. Charity? I don't know how to say that again. A servant returning home one night was shot down by his own master, the woolen draper Alexandra Misnaud, who mistook him for the infamous murderer of young girls. Whoever could afford it sent his adolescent daughters to distant relatives or to boarding schools in Nice, Ait, or Marseille. The police lieutenant was removed from office at the insistence of the town council. His successor at the College of Medicine examined the bodies of the shorn beauties to determine the state of their virginity. It was found that they had all remained untouched. Strangely enough, this knowledge only increased the sense of horror, for everyone had secretly assumed that the girls had been ravished. People had at least known the murderer's motive. Now they knew nothing at all. They were totally perplexed, and whoever believed in God sought succor, in the prayer that at least his own house should be spared this visitation from hell. The town council was a committee of 30 of the richest and most influential commoners and nobles in Grasse. The majority of them were enlightened and anti-clerical, paid not the least attention to the bishop, and would have preferred to turn the cloisters and abbeys into warehouses or factories. In their distress, the proud, powerful men of the town council condescended to write an abject petition begging the bishop to curse and excommunicate this monster who murdered young girls, and yet whom temporal powers could not capture, just as his illustrious predecessor had done in the year 1708, when terrible locusts had threatened the land. And indeed, at the end of September, the slayer of the young women of Grasse, having cut down no fewer than 24 of its most beautiful virgins out of every social class, was made anathema and excommunicated both in writing and from all the pulpits of the city, including a ban spoken by the bishop himself from the pulpit of Notre Dame du Puy. The result was conclusive. From one day to the next, the murders ceased. October and November passed with no corpses. At the start of December, reports came in from Grenoble, that a murderer there was strangling young girls, then tearing their clothes to shreds and pulling their hair out by the handfuls. And although these coarse methods in no way squared with the cleanly executed crimes of the Grasse murderer, everyone was convinced that it was one and the same person. In their relief that the beast was no longer among them, but instead ravaging Grenoble, a good 7 days' journey distant, the citizens of Grasse crossed themselves 3 times over. They organized a torchlight procession in honor of the bishop and celebrated the Mass of Thanksgiving on December 24. On January 1st, 1766, the tightest security measures were relaxed and the nighttime curfew for women was lifted. Normality returned to public and private life with incredible speed. Fear had melted into thin air. No one spoke of the terror that had ruled both town and countryside only a few months before. Not even the families involved still spoke of it. It was as if the bishop's curse had not only banned the murderer, but every memory of him. And the people were pleased that it was so. But any man who still had a daughter just approaching that special age did not, even now, allow her to be without supervision. Twilight brought misgivings, and each morning, when he found her healthy and cheerful, he rejoiced, though of course without actually admitting the reasons why. 41. This one isn't too long. There was one man in Grasse, however, who did not trust this peace. His name was Antoine Riches. He held the title of second consul, and he lived in a grand residence at the entrance to the Rue Droit. Droit. Riches was a widower and had a daughter named Laura. Although not yet 40 years old and of undiminished vigor, he intended to put off a second marriage for some time yet. First, he wanted to find a husband for his daughter, and not the first comer either, but a man of rank. There was a Baron de Bouillon who had a son and an estate near Venice, a man of good reputation and miserable financial situation, with whom Riches had already concluded a contract concerning the future marriage of their children. Once he had married Laura off, he planned to put out his own courting feelers in the direction of the highly esteemed houses of Dre, Maubert, or for Fond not because he was vain and would be damned if he didn't get a noble bedmate, but because he wanted to found a dynasty and to put his own posterity on a track leading directly to the highest social and political influence. For that, he needed at least two sons, one to take over his business, the other to pursue a law career leading to the parliament in I and advancement to the nobility. Given his present rank, however, he could hold out hopes for such success only if he managed intimately to unite his own person and family with provincial nobility. Only one thing justified such high soaring plans. His fabulous wealth. Antoine Riches was far and away the wealthiest citizen anywhere around. He possessed latifundia, not only in the area of Grasse, where he planted oranges, oil, wheat, and hemp, but also near Vence, or is that Venice? Vence, I'll go with because that's what it says, toward Antibes, where he leased out his farms. He owned houses in A. Still don't, and still never looked up AIX, so I don't know what his fucking pronunciation is. I'll just say I. And houses in the country, owned shares in ships that traded with India, had a permanent office in Genoa, and was the largest wholesaler for scents, spices, oils, and leathers in France. The most precious thing that Ritchie possessed, however, was his daughter. She was his only child, just turned 16, with auburn hair and green eyes. She had a face so charming that visitors of all ages and both sexes would stand stock still at the sight of her, unable to pull their eyes away, practically licking that face with their eyes, the way tongues work at ice cream, with that typically stupid, single minded expression on their faces that goes with concentrated licking. Even Ricius would catch himself looking at his daughter for indefinite periods of time, a quarter of an hour, a half hour perhaps, forgetting the rest of the world, even his business, which otherwise did not happen even in his sleep. Melting away in contemplation of this magnificent girl, and afterwards unable to say what it was he had been doing. And of late he noticed that with uneasiness of an evening when he brought her to her bed, or sometimes of a morning when he went in to waken her and she still lay sleeping, as if put to rest by God's own hand, and the forms of her hips and breasts were molded in the veil of her nightgown, and her breath rose calm and hot from the frame of bosom, contoured shoulder, elbow, and smooth forearm in which she had laid her face. Then he would feel an awful cramping in his stomach, and his throat would seem too tight, and he would swallow, and God help him, would curse himself for being this woman's father, and not some stranger, not some other man, before whom she lay as she lay now before him, and who then, without scruple and full of desire, could lie down next to her, Jesus Christ, on her, in her, and he broke out in a swear, and his arms and legs trembled. I think that, no, it says say sweat, I think. Does it say swear or sweat? It says sweat. And his arms and legs trembled while he choked down this dreadful lust and bent down to wake her with a chaste, fatherly kiss. During the year just past, at the time of the murders, these fatal temptations had not yet come over him. The magic that his daughter worked on him then, or so at least it seemed to him, had still been a childish magic, and thus he had not been seriously afraid that Laura would be one of the murderer's victims, since everyone knew that he attacked neither children nor grown women, but exclusively ripening but virginal girls. He had indeed augmented the watch of his home. He had new grills placed at the windows of the top floor, and had directed Laura's maid to share her bedchamber with her. But he was loath to send her away as his peers had done with their daughters, some even with their entire families. He found such behavior despicable and unworthy of a member of the town council and second council, who he suggested should be a model of composure, courage, and resolution to his fellow citizens. Besides which, he was a man who did not let his decisions be made for him by other people, nor by a crowd thrown into panic, and certainly not by some anonymous piece of criminal trash. And so, all during those terrible days, he had been one of the few people in the town who were immune to the fever of fear and kept a cool head. But, strange to say, this had now changed, while others publicly celebrated the end of the rampage, as if the murderer were already hanged and had soon fully forgotten about those dreadful days. Fear crept into Antoine Riches's heart like a foul poison. For a long time he would not admit that it was fear that caused him to delay trips that ought to have been made some time ago, or to be reluctant merely to leave the house, or to break off visits and meetings just so that he could quickly return home. He gave himself the excuse that he was out of sorts or overworked, but admitted as well that he was a bit concerned that every father with a daughter of marriageable age is as every father with a daughter of marriageable age is concerned. A thoroughly normal concern. Had not the fame or the beauty already gone out of the wider world, did not people stretch their necks even now when he accompanied her to church on Sundays? Were not certain gentlemen on the council already making advances in their own names or in those of their sons? All right, we can do one more and then I'm outie of this touty. 42. But then, one day in March, Riches was sitting in the salon and watched as Laura walked out into the garden. She was wearing a blue dress, her red hair falling down over it and blazing in the sunlight. He had never seen her look so beautiful. She disappeared behind a hedge, and it took about 2 heartbeats longer than he had expected before she emerged again. And he was frightened to death, for during those 2 heartbeats he thought he had lost her forever. That same night he awoke out of a terrifying dream, the details of which he could no longer remember, but it had to do with Laura, and he burst into her room, convinced that she was dead, lay there in her bed murdered, violated, and shorn, and found her unharmed. He went back to his chamber, bathed in sweat and trembling with agitation. No, not with agitation, but with fear, for he finally admitted it to himself. It was naked fear that had seized him, and in admitting it, he grew calmer and his thoughts clearer. To be honest, he had not believed in that efficacy of the bishop's anathema from the start, nor that the murderer was now prowling about Grenoble, nor that he had ever left town. No, he was still living here among the citizens of Grasse, and at some point he would strike again. Riches had seen several of the girls murdered during August and September. The sight had horrified him, and at the same time he had to admit fascinated him, for they all, each in their own special way, had been of dazzling beauty. He never would have thought that there was so much unrecognized beauty in Grasse. The murderer had opened his eyes. The murderer possessed an exquisite taste, and he had a system. It was not just that all the murders had been carried out in the same efficient manner, but the very choices of victims betrayed intentions almost economical in their planning. To be sure, Ricius did not know what the murderer actually craved from his victim, since he could not have been robbed. He could not have robbed them of the best that they offered, their beauty and the charm of youth. Or could he? In any case, it seemed to him, as absurd as it sounded, that the murderer was not a destructive personality, but rather a careful collector. For if one imagined For if one imagined, as so Ricius imagined, all the victims not as single individuals, but as parts of some higher principle, and thought of each one's characteristics as merged in some idealistic fashion into a unifying whole, then the picture assembled out of such mosaic pieces would be the picture of absolute beauty, and the magic that radiated from it would no longer be of human, but of divine origin. As we can see, Ricius was an enlightened thinker who did not shrink from blasphemous conclusions, and though he was not thinking in olfactory categories, but rather in visual ones, he was nevertheless very near the truth. Assuming then, Ricius continued in his thoughts that the murderer was just such a collector of beauty, and was working on the picture of perfection, even if only in the fantasy of his sick brain. Assuming, moreover, that he was the man of sublime taste and perfect methods that he indeed appeared to be, then one could not assume that he would waive claim to the most precious component on earth needed for his picture, the beauty of Laura. His entire previous homicidal work would be nothing without her. She was the keystone to his building. As he drew this horrifying conclusion, Ricius was sitting in his nightshirt on the edge of his bed, and he was amazed at how calm he had become. He no longer felt chilled, was no longer trembling. The vague fear that had plagued him for weeks had vanished and was replaced by the awareness of a specific danger. Laura had quite obviously been the goal of all the murderers' endeavors from the beginning, and all the other murders were adjuncts to the last crowning murder. It remained quite unclear what material purpose these murders were intended to serve, or if they even had one at all, but Ricius had perceived the essence of the matter, the murderer's systematic method and his idealistic motive. The longer he thought about it, the better both of these pleased him, and the greater his admiration for the murderer, an admiration admittedly that reflected back upon him as would a polished mirror, for after all, it was he, Ricius, who had picked up his opponent's trail with his own refined and analytical powers of reasoning. If he, Ricius, had been the murderer, and were himself possessed by the murderer's passions and ideas, he would not have been able to proceed in any other fashion than had been employed thus far, and like him, he would do his utmost to crown his mad work with the murder of the unique and splendid Laura. This last thought appealed to him especially, because he was in the position to put himself inside the mind of the would-be murderer of his daughter. He had made himself vastly superior to the murderer. For all his intelligence, that much was certain. The murderer was not in the position to put himself inside Ricius's mind, if only because he could not even begin to suspect that Ricius had long since imagined himself in the murderer's own situation. This was fundamentally no different from how things worked in business. Mutatis mutandis, to be sure, you were master of a competitor whose intentions you had seen through. There was no way he could get the better of you. Not if your name was Antoine Ricius and you were a natural fighter, a seasoned fighter. After all, the largest wholesale perfume business in France, his wealth, his office as second counsel, these had not fallen into his lap as gracious gifts, but he had fought for them with doggedness and deceit, recognizing dangers ahead of time, shrewdly guessing his competitors' plans and outdistancing his opponents. And in just the same way, he would achieve his future goals, power, and noble rank for his heirs. And in no other way would he counter the plans of the murderer, his competitor, for the possession of Laura, if only because Laura was also the keystone in the edifice of Ricius's own plans. He loved her, certainly, but he needed her as well, and he would let no one wrest from him whatever it was he needed to realize his own highest ambitions. He would hold on tooth and claw to that. He felt better now, having succeeded by these nocturnal deliberations in bringing his struggle with the demon down to the level of a business rivalry. He felt fresh courage, indeed arrogance, take hold of him. The last remnants of fear were gone. The despondency and anxious care that had tormented him into doddering senility had vanished. The fog of gloomy forebodings in which he had tapped about for weeks had lifted. He found himself on familiar terrain and felt himself equal to every challenge. And that's going to be the end of this reading. Hell yeah. Hell yeah, boy. We're getting there towards the end. That's all. That's all. That's all.